In today's video, we're going to be examining new allegations that have been levelled at Lucy Letby with regard to hospital in Liverpool where she has supposedly removed breathing tubes from young infants. Before we go into that, I just wanted to say that I requested for people to defend Dr. Evans in a previous video, and I did get one message back in which someone attempted to defend him. So this gentleman said, Dr. Evans follows the scientific method fully and accurately, but that is wrong because you think so. He does his job as an expert witness exactly as it should be, revising his conclusions every time new evidence is presented. It's gonna be really difficult for me not to laugh during this message, but I'm doing okay so far. And he manages to do all this in a ridiculously short time frame. So I assume this is some sort of satirical comment. I'm not going to respond to any of these remarks, but I do give this gentleman a lot of credit for coming back with this, nevertheless. So, to resume speaking about these intubation cases, these are cases at Liverpool Women's Hospital in which Lucy has supposedly deliberately removed breathing tubes from young infants, and it was floated. We'd heard about it previously, but it was particularly floated during the BBC Panorama documentary. So on the screen now is the beginning of the section where Judith Moritz begins to talk about this supposed incident. And she says, the current police investigation involves a second hospital in 2012 and 2015. Lucy Letby worked briefly at Liverpool Women's Hospital. A hospital review has found that babies' breathing tubes came out 40 times more often than normal when Lucy Letby was on shift. It's a finding her supporters have questioned. So I particularly resent this term, her supporters, and they have changed this now, but I'll get into that later in the video. More narration from Judith Moritz. We've looked into the evidence, we've looked into it, as if that's going to be helpful. Liverpool Women's Hospital compiled its data by looking at what are called ventilated shifts. That's a 12-hour period where a baby's been on a breathing tube. There are 2 shifts every day, so if you had 10 ventilated babies on a unit for 5 days, you would have 100 ventilated shifts. On average, a tube came out unexpectedly in less than 1% of cases. Lucy Letby worked around 50 shifts, the tube came out on around 20 of them. That's about 40%. So these figures are extremely dubious, and we'll be getting into them as the video continues, but I'm going to first look at what else was said on the Panorama episode. So this is Moritz having a conversation with Jonathan Coffey in what appeared to be her conservatory. It's empirical. I mean, I'm not sure these figures get anywhere near the standard required to describe them as empirical, given that empirical is supposed to be like an accurate measurement of something. It's something they measure right. It's not just a chance of data. This is a really highly monitored thing. It doesn't look good for her. I mean, that's just such an absurd statement. I mean, are these people for real? They actually call themselves journalists? I mean, it's embarrassing. I mean, I was speaking to someone who understands this data, and I said, how bad would she have to have been as a nurse for this to be accidental? And the answer was spectacularly bad. Who were you talking to, John? Who were you talking to? I mean, I've read a bit of Judith's book now. I'm going to be talking about this probably in the next video. I note that they didn't manage to name a single person that they spoke to. Not only that can be understandable because some people wish to remain anonymous, so I'll cut them a bit of slack for that. But not only did they not name them, they didn't tell you as a reader anything that they had said to them, and they didn't quote anything that that person had said in response. They just made a series of statements, as you will see in future videos. This is yet another example of Jonathan Coffey going, I was speaking to someone who understands this data. How do we know? How do we know that person understands this data? What did you say to them specifically, and what did they specifically say to you? This could be anyone. This could be anyone, some random conversation. We don't know how you conveyed it to them, therefore we don't know if you conveyed it to them accurately. If we don't know that you conveyed it to them accurately, and as you've changed all this information now, essentially this conversation that you're just kind of randomly recounting to us could all be completely worthless. Anyway, on he continues. And the answer was spectacularly bad. Either she is spectacularly bad or acting maliciously. That was the answer that came back. So then Moritz continues. So standing back from this, it's what it might say about the longer term, the bigger picture from me. to the extent that I understand it, this looks pretty damning. I mean, I question whether you understand anything, so I wouldn't necessarily worry about that too much. So now she's in the car with Mark McDonald. So we're going to the prison where Lucy Letby's being kept and held. When's the last time you saw her? I think actually it was about 6 weeks. I generally try and talk to her once a week on the phone, share a meal, and then have a conversation. And then this is narration. Letby's defence haven't seen the details of the hospital's ventilated shift review. I think it's a complete load of rubbish, Mark McDonald says. Where's the evidence? If it were true, it would be pretty alarming. It would be if it were true. Show us the evidence. The evidence. This was a bold assertion, and as far as I can see, there is no evidential basis to it whatsoever. If I'm wrong, I'll be corrected. If there is something, then show us this. And then I'm just going to include the last part of Morit's narration here. I noticed that I've mistyped Moritz there. It's so easy to do that. So many people do that. I apologise for that. The stakes couldn't be higher. Depending on which experts are believed, Lucy Letby could spend the rest of her life in prison or be set free. She's a monster or a victim. The reason I wanted to highlight this is that she's kind of implying that, experts are split on this tube thing. They're not broadly split on the evidence anyway, but if you put this in front of actual experts, they will just treat this as completely laughable. Whereas, as we're going to investigate and as we're going to reveal during the video, the person that worked on this is not an expert. They're not even qualified. In fact, they're not even competent. So then there's more narration. If Lucy Letby's lawyer is successful, this is where her case will end up, at the Court of Appeal. And that's when the expert evidence on both sides of this debate will face a true reckoning. So what you're seeing here really from Judith Morris is an incredibly supine attitude towards the Court of Appeal. She could, for example, have mentioned that not long before this programme was recorded, and I'm sure they'll say, we recorded all these segments before this happened, but they could easily revise them, and anyway, there are lots of other historical examples. But she could, for example, have mentioned that Tom Hayes was acquitted and the Supreme Court had to quash the Court of Appeal decision and overrule the Court of Appeal because the Court of Appeal refused to overrule the conviction that had been made. They didn't even reference their own documentary on Colin Norris, let alone any of the historical context on the Court of Appeal and how bad it is. It's just the attitude of, let's wait and see what the court says, and then whatever the court says, we must worship it. That's really her attitude to everything. She just worships establishment, she worships institutions, and she worships power. Which is, I think if you look at the original dictionary definition of a journalist, that's not what you're actually supposed to do. So the first thing to say about this before we go into any of the specifics is that there is no prospect this would go to court in any other scenario. Like, seriously, can you imagine, a nurse was near some tubes on a few occasions and a few of them came out, so we think that it's attempted murder? There's just absolutely no chance. You'd be laughed out of court. Obviously, one would hope the completely incompetent Crown Prosecution Service would actually manage to recognise that this is not even, it doesn't even meet the standard of evidence. It doesn't even meet the standard of being bad evidence. It's just absolute tosh. It's complete and utter tripe. As for Cheshire Police, all we ever hear from them is, the families, or we don't want to upset the families. But now, they've gone around upsetting a load of families in Liverpool for absolutely no reason and telling them, Lucy Letby's probably tried to kill your baby. On the basis of this absolutely spurious evidence, having previously arrested the executives, which, as I've shown in the previous video, was also completely spurious. I'll ask the rhetorical question of what possible public good does this serve? Peter Hitchens previously spoke about Child K when the retrial was occurring and said exactly the same thing. What good does this do? Who does this help exactly? And of course, we know that case was unbelievably dubious. I'm going to be talking about Child K later in this video. These cases are equally as specious as Child K, and yet we don't know how many parents, but several sets of parents from Liverpool associated with Liverpool and Liverpool Women's Hospital, they have now been upset for no reason, and they are now sitting there every day thinking Lucy Letby might have murdered my child or tried to murder my child, even though there's absolutely no evidential basis for this whatsoever. So Professor Jane Hutton has already responded to the actual figures and the actual so-called evidence, so-called science, so-called mathematics, so-called statistics that was used in this program. We see here Dr. Philip Hammond describing this as a strongly worded complaint to the BBC about the intubation dislodgement statistics that were misused in Panorama. Dr. Hammond describes this as a recurrent theme in the prosecution of the case, and that it's sad to see journalists falling into the same trap, which I think is a fairly mild description of what has occurred. So I'll read out the letter that Jane Hutton has sent to the BBC. I'm going to give the BBC one piece of credit in this video. They did actually listen to her. The same can't be said for the criminal justice system, because we know what happened to Jane Hutton in the criminal justice system. Dear BBC complaints team, it's quite amusing that she corrected the grammar here. I have been asked to comment on the numbers discussed by Judith Morris and Jonathan Coffey on unplanned extubations, UE, accidental dislodgement of endotracheal tubes at the Liverpool Women's Hospital. They essentially repeated information which Mr. Richard Baker KC gave to the Thirlwell Inquiry on the 12th of September 2024. You will hear evidence that it generally occurs in less than 1% of shifts. As a side note, you will hear that an audit carried out by Liverpool Women's Hospital recorded that, while Letby was working there, dislodgement of tubes occurred in 40% of the shifts she worked. The evidence was not provided. The judicial colleges endorsed the principles that, when conclusions based on statistical science are drawn from data, it is crucial that the data and the reasoning supporting those conclusions are transparent. The use of statistics in legal proceedings, a primer for courts. 2020 Royal Society and Royal Society of Scotland. No information from the LWH audit of UEs, the definition of dislodgement of endotracheal tubes design, conduct or analysis of the audit, has been released to Letby or her defence team. The journalist said that LWH used ventilated shifts, a 12-hour period during which a baby is ventilated rather than the usual ventilated days. They used the assumption of 10 ventilated babies on a unit for 5 days, 20 shifts, and stated that the UE rate was less than 1%. A systematic review published in 2012 by De Silva et al. Reported that UE is a common event in the NICU. The median UEs/100 intubation days was 1.98. This is 4% of ventilated shifts. The authors note that not all UEs are recorded. The journalist claimed Letby worked about 50 shifts without any reference to the number of babies ventilated, and said the tube came out on around 20 of them. It's about 40%. This is dreadfully bad arithmetic and seriously misleading journalism. There are 24 high dependency or intensive care cots at Liverpool Women's Hospital. I have to make assumptions in the absence of transparency. Suppose only 10 of the 24 cots. Let me just stop there for a second before I continue. That's a key point. It's the complete lack of transparency. I've already cited this in this video, but we see that repeated in the book. It's just Judith Morris going, I asked someone and someone said this, so we've proved that she's guilty. Literally, that is what it is. There's not a single quote. There's not a single identification of anyone. Okay, you can't give their name. At least give some indication of their background. You don't say anything that you said to them. You don't say anything that they said to you. We just go, oh, we spoke to someone. They reckon this, so we've proved our case. It's a joke. It's an absolute joke. These people are probably on six-figure salaries. And they can't do the most basic things. It was an embarrassment. All I can say to people is defund the BBC. They shouldn't be receiving any money at this point. They don't serve their purpose. They don't do a public service. They don't even have any sport anymore. Why do they even exist? What do they do with the billions of pounds they receive every year, apart from give it to presenters, to present rubbish? What do they do with it? They're like make EastEnders. Anyway, let's continue. Suppose only 10 of the 24 cots were occupied by infants who had breathing tubes. That gives 500 ventilator shifts, which would give the median rate of 4% of ventilated shifts. A further obviously misleading element is the implications that the infants were under Letby's care, but no nurse would care for several intensive care patients. Methods for identification of variations from the norm were first proposed a century ago. A brief history of statistical process control 2021 D. Sealand Quality Magazine. The 2011 Department of Health and Healthcare Quality Improvement Partnership Guidance on Detection and Management of Outliers states the statistical analyses involved should be carried out by people with appropriate statistical expertise and experience. That seems like rather a no-brainer, doesn't it? The journalists broadcast seriously erroneous information. I request that you publish a formal apology and correction. You could ask Tim Harford of BBC Radio 4's More or Less to assist you in finding an experienced and qualified statistician. I know that the Crown Prosecution Service did not wish to pursue inquiries into the validity of the statistical evidence, not for the first time. And then Professor Richard Gill, friend of the channel of course, has also spoken on this topic. So I'd like to go over what he had to say, or some of the key points. The first thing is that the BBC, and which is quite right to point out, has apologised to Mark MacDonald. They've been forced to apologise directly to Lucy's defence barrister and been forced to correct the Panorama documentary itself. Now, that's a pretty major climb down for the BBC. They don't usually make major changes, particularly to a flagship programme that's gone out on BBC One at 8 p.m. Within a matter of days, they've had to change quite significant information about it, and they should have changed more. In fact, they should have pulled the whole section. There's still stuff in there that shouldn't be in there, but they've had to factually alter certain things because they know that they're wrong. Even just simply the fact, though, that they're dealing with 4 tubes falling out is such a pathetically small sample size, it's almost completely meaningless. Anyway, Richard goes on to discuss some of the statistical things that he's been doing in relation to this relate to what are called binomial probabilities. This sounds very complicated, but he describes it as elementary stuff for a statistician. And what he said is that from this, he's virtually completely certain that the true probability for what they've outlined in the Panorama programme lies between 7 and 77%. So I think what you could immediately say about that as a non-statistician and non-mathematician is that this is a degree of confidence and a degree of statistical likelihood that cannot be used easily in a court case or criminal prosecution. Even if it's 1%, that's just something that happens 1 every 100 times. So across a big data set, of course it can happen, and it will happen. I explained this to someone before on Reddit who was a bit confused, and I tried to say to them, look, if you've got a big system like the NHS, something that happens 1% of the time will happen every year, numerous times. So that's the first thing to say about confidence intervals and about these figures. So then Richard goes on to explain that we don't know anything about these infants. So it's 11 babies, we don't know the physical state, we don't know their condition, we don't know what was happening at the time, we don't have any information about them. And I will say in addition to that, it would presumably be quite difficult to actually acquire this information, considering that we're looking at going back 13 years for some of these incidents, or these alleged incidents. And then Richard explains that he went through some peer-reviewed papers and he found that a 1% per day extubation rate is normal. But you can find scenarios where when a baby's been intubated, in about 50% of the cases, the tube will come out or has to be taken out, then another intubation is required. Of course, as we know from the court case, there are multiple instances where this occurs. There are multiple instances at the Council of Chester where an attempted tube procedure is attempted and it fails, sometimes they're having to do it multiple times. So then Richard goes on to say that essentially there's a 50% chance of tubes falling out if Lucy intubates these babies herself, which is basically slap bang in the middle of the confidence interval that he's calculated. So he goes on to point out, not unreasonably, no one involved in this seems to know anything about statistics. But I think that is actually a generous assessment. You know, obviously they should involve professional statisticians, that goes without saying, but I mean, this is basic maths. You should know if there's 4 tubes that fall out. I mean, it's nowhere near the standard required. Why don't you just cut it down to 1 tube and say, oh look, Lucy did 1 shift and 1 tube fell out, so it was 100% of the time. Obviously that's total crap, but it's hardly much better if you're looking at 4 tubes. That's before you look at anything else at all. It's like when we were talking about the shift chart and when I interviewed Richard, you know, you're comparing Lucy with people who are part-time and bank staff. They're not even employed at the hospital. It means nothing. Absolutely nothing. So anyway, Richard explains that clearly they should have gone back to the source, sourced additional information, consulted a professional statistician. You would think that would be requisite in a criminal trial if you want to present statistics. So it's impossible to disagree with that. But I think it goes further than that. It's just indicative of basic lack of intelligence and competence. Richard explains that he wrote to the Cheshire Constabulary and indicated he would look at the 40% number. Unsurprisingly, he never got a reply. He wrote to Jonathan Coffey, they ignored him, and now they've had to backtrack on what they said. And he said he believes that Judith and Jonathan have been misled very easily, which I would agree with. But that doesn't surprise me because essentially this is a very self-serving position that they've taken. They want Lucy to be guilty, particularly Judith Morris is very invested in this. So any nonsense they can dredge up that might point to that, they're willing to do it. That's how I view it. I don't view it as them being misled. I view it as them having essentially a bias running through everything that they do, particularly Judith. So then Richard goes on to talk about Bill Yoxall at Liverpool Women's Hospital, who was mentioned in the Panorama programme and was involved with the accumulation of these statistics. Richard quite rightly says that he could be a very good paediatrician or neonatologist or whatever position he's employed in, but he's a close friend of Dr. Stephen Breary. He also mentions that mothers in Liverpool are allowed to have their babies at the Counter Chester on his watch, and there's a strong argument that this shouldn't have happened. So Yoxall has been involved in the gathering of data, which Richard describes as very shaky and simply this data cannot be trusted. And I think that applies on two levels. Firstly, Yoxall is mathematically and statistically not only unqualified, I mean that's undeniable, but inept. And then secondly, he has this quite matey relationship with Stephen Breary. So we're going to look at that in a document from the Thirlwell inquiry. So we're going to look at this email from the Thirlwell inquiry that was sent shortly after, or is this just before Lucy was first arrested? This is around the time Lucy was arrested anyway. And we see Stephen Breary saying, "Thanks very much. It is very worrying. I've intentionally not mentioned nursing names, but the same one keeps coming up in this case that we have been worried about with all the others. I'll leave that for the police to sort out." I'm not going to commentate too much on this. You've all seen the previous video with Stephen Breary. I know there are question marks regarding his sincerity or otherwise. For him to characterise the situation in that way is a little bit despicable, I would say. And then in response, Bill Yoxall says, "Hi Steve, bloody hell, I have deliberately not pried into any of the details of your investigation, but this sounds very worrying. I think your conclusions are all fine and justifiable and probably correct." So he's coming to this with his mind couldn't be more open, could it? "I have added some comments to the attached for you to consider. Always happy to help if there is anything else I can do, Bill." "Hi Bill, thanks very much for your help. I've attached the draft. Don't worry, respelling and grammar. It's really the conclusions, whether I might be making any unreasonable ones. Yeah, don't worry if you can actually write or not, it's fine. Cheers, Steve." "Hi Steve, yes of course, no problem at all for me to look at this for you. Glad to hear Heather has not been too much trouble. Very weird thinking about being something. Do you want to email it here or my home email address, Bill Yoxall at?" Sadly, they have understandably suppressed that. "Hi Bill, hope you are enjoying the sunshine during your night's week." Whatever that means. Oh, it works at nights over the week, right. "I was wondering if you'd be able to help me with a police statement, please. I've already done one for them last year, which included all the babies in the review at the time following an 8-hour interview. They asked me in February to review the twin sibling survivors of the babies in the investigation to advise them on whether any of these should be included in the investigation." So this just further cements what I said in the previous video. Firstly, he's done an 8-hour interview. Now, during that 8-hour interview, obviously, it goes without saying that we never get to hear any of that. The police obviously hold that and never make it transparent because we don't have transparency in this country. That's very clear. Not only does he do an 8-hour interview with them, I assume during that interview they didn't for 1 second say, "Did you do anything wrong, Steve, by any chance?" Because they never question the consultants on anything. The consultants just walk into the hospital and say, into the police station rather, and say, "Oh, we think this, this and this." "All right, okay, well that's fine. We'll just proceed on that basis then." That's the first thing. And then the second thing is we see Breary, "Oh, the police just asked me to review the twin sibling survivors." Why? You're the person making the accusation. You're the person that's run the case in the hospital, the campaign. There's no way you should be involved. It's just an absolute joke. And then he's now involving his mate Yoxall. Yoxall's going, oh, well, you're probably completely correct about everything, Steve. Oh, wait a minute, I've seen something slightly dodgy. Oh, well, we'll try and take that to court as well. Like, you couldn't make it up. You honestly couldn't make it up. I mean, the lack of professionalism and the lack of professional standards is stultifying. So he goes on. One of the siblings' cases is quite concerning, and they have asked me to provide a statement for this one. I've made a draft last Friday afternoon and was wondering if you could find time to read through it confidentially. I want to be quite clear about my concerns, read this case, but also as factual as possible. So now Stephen Brere's sharing his draft about all his concerns on the case with Bill Yoxall. This is before Bill Yoxall is now going to start raising suspicions of Lucy Letby. The execs here have always tried to portray us as having made totally unreasonable allegations without them ever investigating our concerns properly. Didn't give them any evidence. We know that 100% because the police said it. So I don't want to appear irrational in any of the statements or conclusions I've made in the report. It will all be very obvious to you once you start reading it. It's still very first draft and I still need to run it past my MPS lawyer. It's particularly the conclusions towards the end that it would be nice for an experienced neonatologist with some medico-legal experience to check, please. If you are happy to help, I'll send it on to you. Thanks for your time and support through all this, Steve. And then this PS, it's been great having Heather working for us, irrelevant and sensitive, almost on you. So it'd be interesting to have a caption competition as to what the irrelevant and sensitive comment was. But I guess we'll never know. But all I can say regarding that email is you can see how deeply inappropriate this is, but we're going to go on to look at this further still. So in a statement to Thirlwell Inquiry, Bill Yoxall said the following. When the police contacted Liverpool Women's Hospital to inform us of Lucy Letby's arrest in 2018, I mean, that was barely necessary because your friend from the Council of Chester has been priming you the whole time, and informed us that she'd worked on the NICU at Liverpool Women's Hospital. I was tasked with reviewing all the neonatal deaths that had occurred at Liverpool Women's Hospital during these periods, as well as the case note for all the babies who had been cared for in our intensive care nurseries. Of course, I'd already concluded that Stephen Brere was correct and Lucy Letby was guilty at this point. Following those reviews, I developed some suspicions and concerns about the care that the babies in Lucy Letby's care had received. I have made those concerns known to the police and made a series of statements in relation to those incidents. I understand that those matters are still under police investigation. And it's taken them, 7 years to get to this point? 7 years to investigate, some figures from Bill Yoxall that don't make any sense, that statisticians just think are laughable. But it's taken them 7 years to investigate this, and now finally they've passed the case file on. Obviously there can be other infants involved, we don't know that yet, but if these cases, it was certainly stated in the Panorama programme, and they will be getting briefing from the police, presumably, it was certainly stated that the cases have been passed to the Crown Prosecution Service are these tube intubation cases. So they've done a 7-year investigation to get this ready for the Crown Prosecution Service, and at the end of it, we know the gist of the figures, and they've been pulled apart by statisticians in one day, and then Panorama have had to run away from them. So that's the outcome of their 7-year investigation. But what I would say in addition to that is that on no reasonable basis is Yoxall either objective or impartial. We know from previous videos that I've made that that's never bothered Chester Constabulary previously, so I can't see any particular reason why they should start worrying about it now. But I mean, there could hardly be more cronyism in this case. It's so inappropriate and so wrong. Truly, it's quite embarrassing for everyone involved, in my opinion. And then we move on to comments made by Svilena Dimitrova on Twitter, and she says, entirely reasonably in my opinion, I'm still astonished that anyone with an education beyond high school could have considered this data remotely credible. I suppose where I would disagree with that is that I'm pretty confident when I was 12 or 13 years old that I could have seen the problems in this. Now, admittedly, I was fairly bright and fairly good at maths, but I do think there's people that yet to sit the GCSEs who could tell you the problems with this. But I definitely agree with the gist of what she's saying. We didn't need a statistician to point it out, it was obvious. Frankly, I'm embarrassed on behalf of both the medical and legal professions that such nonsense went unchallenged. I am not, however, surprised that Morris and Coffey parroted it. As you may know, I wrote, along with 3 others, including 2 consultants and Peter Elston, to Lady Justice Thirlwell challenging the absurd misuse of statistics in these outrageous claims. Unsurprisingly, our letter, like every other reasoned objection, was ignored. We're sliding further and further into idiocracy. For those unfamiliar with the film, it's worth watching as it's rapidly becoming our day-to-day reality quicker than reading 1984. So obviously I entirely agree with what she said there. And then she goes on to, in a later tweet, she is talking about this apology that the BBC has made to Mark MacDonald, and they've issued a public apology. And she talks about this, and she describes it as a feeble response and so-called retraction attempts to smear the very experts who politely warned them about their reckless claims, branding them as Lucy Letby supporters. Now, I just want to mention one thing. I don't disagree with what she's saying. In many ways, she's absolutely right. But as I mentioned, for the BBC to back away from something so quickly, that's on their flagship Panorama programme, broadcast on BBC One at 8 p.m, and to change it and to take that broadcast version off the internet completely is a big deal. They don't do that kind of thing lightly. So it is actually quite a significant climb down for the BBC. She's probably quite right in saying that it doesn't go far enough, but they usually don't bother apologising at all. So the fact it realises they know how bad it is. So the fact they've said we're factually incorrect in one of the major assertions of the programme is actually quite a big deal, to be fair. So she says here, Morris and Coffey had only 11 months to correct this nonsense, as did Lady Justice Thirlwall. Spreading misinformation to stoke hysteria, it seems, remains their favourite pastime, aided and abetted by our favourite trash journalism platform, the BBC. Still haven't found this retraction online. And by the way, accidental extubations of preterm babies are very common. I have previously explained why via Dr. Philip Hammond, and your continued misrepresentation of reality does not change it. So she also published this letter that has been sent, or email that's been sent to Mark MacDonald. Further to my email of Monday the 11th of August, I would like to draw your attention to a correction we've now made to the programme on the iPlayer. As you know, we reported that whilst Lucy Letby was working at the Liverpool Women's Hospital in 2012 and 2015, a hospital review had found that she worked around 50 ventilated shifts and that a breathing tube came out on around 20 of them. We reported this because we understood the 40% figure first raised at the Thirlwall inquiry related to your client's shifts in 2012 and 2015. However, we have since learned that the 40% figure relates only to the ventilated shifts during which Lucy Letby was involved in the care of a baby in 2015. We understand the review found there were 11 such ventilated shifts and 4 unplanned extubations. This represents a percentage closer to 36 than 40. Perhaps more importantly, it just has absolutely no merit whatsoever, but hey. We also understand breathing tubes became dislodged during ventilated shifts involving Lucy Letby in 2012. We don't have the figures, but understand it happened much less often than in 2015. So this will be like 1 out of 10 or something like that, or 1 out of 20. In the programme, we stated that the review found that babies' breathing tubes came out 40 times more often than normal when Lucy Letby was on shift. We have now removed that line from the programme and some associated commentary. We have changed the programme further to make it clear that she was in training during both periods at the Liverpool Women's Hospital. We also originally stated that Lucy Letby supporters questioned the review's finding around Liverpool Women's Hospital. This has now been changed to say that critics say the hospital review findings are not credible and that there are any number of reasons why breathing tubes could become dislodged more often. It's not really critics, it's just anyone with 2 brain cells to rub together. You don't have to be a critic, you just need to be capable of very basic critical thinking. A note explaining these changes is now available on the BBC's clarifications and corrections page. Yours sincerely, Karen Whiteman. And then in a rare tweet from myself, I just responded to Svilena that I'm glad she highlighted this smear of using Letby supporters. I think it's totally wrong to do that, and I have incredibly low expectations of the BBC, but I'm still surprised they put that in there because it just indicates a complete lack of objectivity. So I just said, I don't know Lucy Letby, nor have I had any interaction with her. I greatly sympathise with Lucy's predicament, but this is about whether patient safety and the principle of fair trial actually matters in this country. So the next thing to say about this is that we've seen these tube extubation cases in the court case before because Lucy's already facing a life sentence in relation to child K. Now, we know the quality of evidence in relation to child K was not particularly impressive. So I'm just going to briefly go over some of that to remind you of what occurred in both the original trial and retrial of child K. So it was alleged that Dr. Jairam had found the breathing tube of child K had been dislodged. Of course, as we've been over now in the channel many times, and I'm going to reiterate this again as the video continues, we know that breathing tubes can become detached. There's nothing unusual about this. It happens all the time. Child K was very premature and had been sedated and inactive. We'll come back to that in a second. The tube had been secured by tape and attached to child K's headgear. Nick Johnson said, "It's well recognised if you handle a child you can dislodge the tube accidentally, but any experienced staff member would recognise that. Dr. Jairam was troubled as the levels were falling and nurse Lucy Letby had been the only person in the room." So with regard to that, Dr. Jairam previously indicated to the police that child K had been sedated with morphine. This was pointed out by someone to me recently. But in fact, this is completely untrue. Dr. Jairam said, the baby was sedated, and we went into the court case with that belief, which is why I've just mentioned that in the previous section. But as it turns out, this is completely incorrect. Child K was not on a morphine infusion prior to the desaturation. So then Dr. Jairam says, but it wasn't a vigorous baby. Well, hold on a second. A minute ago, the baby was sedated. There's a bit of a difference between the two. Then he says, in retrospect, he will accept the morphine was not running. Well, you don't have any choice. This is just a fact. And then, he starts going on about, he's a 25-week gestational age, only weighs 600 grams. It was poorly but stable, even though we know neonates can dislodge their tubes. It's as simple as that. This is yet another example of someone in court from the prosecution. Jairam's acting for the prosecution, let's be clear. Just, we've made that up. That turned out to be wrong. Now we'll say this. That's incorrect. We'll just say that instead. It's never, actually, okay, fair enough. We're incorrect about that. I mean, Dr. Jairam, if he had any kind of objectivity at this point, he would accept, actually, there's a good chance that this was just an accidental extubation, which happened all the time. It's absolutely right that he's facing the allegation that he's facing currently, based on what you see of his cross-examination in this court case. So we see as well, I'll read this whole thing out. On these monitors, this is the prosecution stating, on these monitors all readings are set to default values in the neonatal unit. Saturation levels falling to the 80s is a serious issue, and if the machine is working properly, it would have an alarm if the saturation levels fell to the 80s, as Dr. Jairam noticed. There is an alarm pause button on the screen of the monitor. If you want to treat the child, you don't want the alarm going away. It will pause for 1 minute. Bearing in mind the rate displayed on the monitor, Dr. Jairam estimates the tube would have been dislodged between 30 to 60 seconds, and that is on the assumption the alarm had been cancelled once. The court hears that Dr. Jairam did not make a contemporaneous note of his suspicions or the alarm failing to activate. And the reason he didn't do this is because there's nothing suspicious about it. And I've been over in previous videos the fact that he said the behaviour of Lucy Letby was absolutely normal. It's what would be expected. It was standard practice on the unit. That's why he hasn't made a contemporaneous note at the time. If there was any serious suggestion of him having witnessed Lucy Letby murdering a baby, he would have made a note. I mean, he would have escalated it very rapidly if he had any sense. So, I mean, that indicates immediately that this was an incident of no consequence at the time, which is why he never mentioned it to anyone for over 450 days. So then in court, we hear at 12:56 p.m, we hear this fairly remarkable statement that child K remained unwell and later died. Yeah, died 3 days later in a different hospital 20 miles away that was nothing to do with Lucy Letby, literally over 72 hours after she had any contact with the infant. And it's disgusting. This court case is an absolute disgrace. And they're now trying to level more ridiculous allegations. Oh, a tube had fallen out. Oh, it's 40% of the time. Oh, it's not 40% of the time. Oh, it's only 4 tubes. Oh, actually, she was supervised all the time. It's a joke. It's an absolute joke. The fact the police are pursuing this and they've submitted a file to the Crown Prosecution Service is laughable, embarrassing. And then, of course, we know that Dr. Jairam has sent this email in which he's given a completely different version of events. And then, quite rightly, in relation to that, David Davis has written to the police urging them to invest Dr. Jairam for perjury. I don't believe for 1 second they're going to do this properly, because everything that they're doing at the moment is in self-interest. So we've not heard anything about these perjury allegations at all. I wonder if we ever will hear anything. So I'm now going to go over a few examples of academic papers on accidental tube extubations. There are many more. This doesn't even scratch the surface of what's actually available, but I'm just going to go over a few of them. So in 2020, there's this paper in a paediatric journal, Reducing Unplanned Extubations in a Level 4 Neonatal Intensive Care Unit, the Elusive Benchmark. Then we have this paper from 1988, Prevention of Accidental Extubation in Newborns, a comparative study. Then we have this is very recent. I believe this may even have been published this year, Reducing Unplanned Extubation in Tertiary NICU, a Quality Improvement Project. I suppose you could argue that the Council of Chester wasn't a tertiary NICU, it's just that these infants should have been cared for on a tertiary NICU. Probably child K was one that should definitely have been present on a tertiary NICU, given that it was 25 weeks old and weighing only 600 grams. Very, very vulnerable infant that sadly passed away on the Wirral, I believe. Next one, this is also a very recent paper, Prevention of Unplanned Extubation in Neonatal Patients, Protocol for Systematic Review and Meta-Analysis. And then in addition to that, from the panel, there are numerous examples of multiple intubations and extubations. I'm just going to look at a couple of examples here. Child D was electively intubated after 3 attempts and ventilated. And then child K itself was resuscitated with bagging and intubated after 3 attempts with a size 2 endotracheal tube. The overall picture from this unit led the panel to emphasise the poor skills at resuscitation and intubation, poor supervision of junior doctors in procedures such as intubation, and failure to protect at-risk patients, e.g. haemophilia, from trauma during intubation. Now, the next thing to mention is that Lucy's not on her own. This is rather obvious considering that she's a student who's there to learn from working in an actual hospital, but we see here an extract from a recent Nadine Dorries article in which she comments that I understand that the entire time she was on the course, she was supervised one by one by another nurse or staff member, because that is how training courses in specialised units are conducted, which would be literally exactly what everyone would expect. Interesting article to read that, where Nadine Dorries has spoken to some of Lucy's friends and they've made some very interesting observations, so you should definitely read that if you get a chance. Another point that was made by Mark Mays is that Lucy might have logged problems more keenly. We know that she's done that in Chester, so that should be taken into consideration as well. And then we already know from the Thirlwell inquiry that supervision takes place. So this is a statement that was made during the Thirlwell inquiry submitted to Thirlwell, in which one of the people who were one of her mentors and assessors, I believe her surname is Davis, states, during the placement, Letby will have worked on the NICU at Liverpool Women's Hospital. As she was on an intensive care placement, it is likely that she will also have attended delivery suite with the neonatal team. Letby would have been working with the intensive care environment, within the intensive care environment. Within this, she would have been responsible for the recording of observations, ensuring fluids were being delivered via pumps. She would not have had responsibility for preparing setting pumps or changing fluid regimes. She would have administered feeds, changed nappies, helped with x-rays, intubation of babies, helped with insertion of lines, resuscitations, and taking babies out for cuddles. This would have all been done under the supervision of a qualified nurse, which is pretty damned obvious, I say anyway, because she's there to be assessed as a student. She's not there to run the hospital. She's not there to do procedures that she's literally being trained to do. Of course she's going to be supervised. So what's the chances that, oh, I'll just nip out for a quick fag, don't pull any tubes out while I'm gone? What are the chances? It's just absolutely ridiculous. All that's happened is she's been on the unit. Maybe she's been involved in doing the intubations because she's practicing, or maybe not. Maybe the nurse that she's with has done them. Maybe they've fallen out because she's, learning how to do it. And now they're saying, oh, this is a crime. It's an absolute farce. I mean, I've said already this case is a national embarrassment. If this case goes to court, if we see a court case over these tube intubation cases, assuming that is what has been referred by the Crown Prosecution Service, the national embarrassment is getting bigger and bigger, because I've said previously there's stuff in this case that a GCSE student wouldn't submit for a project. I mean, this is getting down to 10-year-old, 11-year-old stuff now. I mean, I think I was intelligent enough when I was, at primary school to see the problems with this. I really genuinely do. Certainly professionals, someone who's supposed to be a neonatologist is submitting this as evidence when he can't add up properly, let alone do statistics. It's ridiculous. It's embarrassing. Truly is embarrassing. I don't think I can say the word embarrassing often enough, because there's just no way this should go to court. So, in response to this absolute shambles, Panorama released a statement. Now, they should put this on primetime BBC One, but of course they don't. They just put it on their website. And they said the following. Panorama looked at 2 periods during which Lucy Letby had worked at Liverpool Women's Hospital in 2012 and 2015. The programme reported that a review by the hospital had found the nurse had worked approximately 50 ventilated shifts there, and that the baby's breathing tubes came out on around 20 of them, or 40%. We have since learned that these figures are wrong. The 40% figure, which was first mentioned in the Thirlwell inquiry in September 2024, only applies to her work at the hospital in 2015. We understand that the hospital's review found that in 2015 there were 11 ventilated shifts during which Lucy Letby was involved in the care of a baby. Now, before we go any further, isn't this the kind of thing that you're supposed to find out as journalists? Being a journalist, it doesn't just mean you go to an authority or you go to an institution and then the institution or authority says, this happened, and then you just report it back. That's not being a journalist, that's being a repeater. You're supposed to look into things and investigate them yourselves and indeed corroborate whether or not they're correct. That's kind of, the foundation of journalism. It also found that tubes became dislodged during 4 of these ventilated shifts, which is around 36%. We understand that some breathing tubes also became dislodged on ventilated shifts where Lucy Letby was involved in the care of a baby during her first period at Liverpool Women's Hospital in 2012. We don't have those figures, and we have now been told that the rate during that period is substantially lower than 40%. We have re-edited the film to reflect all of this and to make our reporting of the hospital review clearer. We did not conflate ventilated shifts with working or unit shifts, but accept our language could have been clearer. We have now made it explicitly clear that the review only looked at ventilated shifts. In the programme, we also state that the review found that babies' breathing tubes came out 40 times more often than normal when Lucy Letby was on shift. We have now removed that line from the programme and some associated commentary. We have also made clear that Lucy Letby was in training during both periods at Liverpool Women's Hospital. We originally stated that her supporters questioned the review's findings around Liverpool Women's Hospital, and this has now been changed to say that critics say the hospital's findings are not credible, and there are any number of reasons why breathing tubes could become dislodged more often. Now, in addition to that, I should also state that Richard Baker, KC, made these statements at the Thirlwell inquiry. So now that we know definitively, beyond all doubt, that they're completely wrong, are they going to be retracted from the Thirlwell inquiry? And is Dr. Richard Baker KC, is he going to issue some sort of apology? I mean, I think we can say for certain that Richard Baker will not issue an apology. Is this statement going to be extracted from the Thirlwell inquiry and retracted? And is it going to be made clear that it's completely untrue? Because at the moment, in this absolutely ridiculous situation that exists, as far as we know, the Thirlwell inquiry are still waiting to come back in January and say, oh, cases should be referred to the police more quickly. Now, if they do this, I've already highlighted in a previous video how dangerous this is, but the way things are going, we're going to have to import every single nurse that works in the NHS because people are going to be leaving in droves. It's it's going to become such a spectacularly unsafe profession unless we learn the lessons from this egregious, very obvious miscarriage of justice that is full of just absolute junk, not even bad science, but just completely flawed thinking that, as I say, it would be laughed out of a school project, frankly. In addition to the correction, there's also a message on the iPlayer page now that says this programme has been edited since broadcast with a section about ventilated shifts being changed because the original figures were inaccurate. The graphic in this section has also been changed. So in summary, this is a frankly incredible situation. This involves a charge that wouldn't be levelled at anyone under any other circumstances because there is literally no evidence. And even the case that's been put together is based on woefully inadequate and inaccurate statistics. You then have the national broadcast of this country, which is publicly funded and is supposed to be publicly accountable, that requires everyone that owns a TV to give them money every year so they can provide some sort of public service. And the BBC are amplifying these figures and essentially acting as a cheerleader for them, even though they've had to climb down within a few days and admit that a large part of what they put in the programme was completely inaccurate. And this is all based on cronyism between Brewery and Yoxall, with the latter providing the figures, even though he's completely unqualified to do so and has quite obviously made a complete pig's ear of it, having already essentially decided that Lucy Letby was guilty. Well, the fact that he has a close relationship with Brewery means that he's in no way objective. Of course, this hasn't stopped Cheshire Police from working with him, as we've already seen them work with Brewery and JRAM, even though they very clearly ran a 2-year campaign against Lucy Letby on the neonatal unit. Frankly, if you put this in a satirical novel, people would say that it's too far-fetched. You know, it sounds like something from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, from some far-flung planet, but unfortunately, it's happening in actual reality in our country. And finally, just to wrap things up for this video, I want to mention a couple of final things. Firstly, and naturally, of course, no one has seen Lucy do anything wrong. Yet again, this is another series of acts that have not been witnessed by anyone. So how many is that now? I believe there were 24 separate acts in the original case, and now there's 4 more attacks here at least. So now it's 28 attacks that no one has witnessed. Why don't we go further back into her life? Why don't we go back to secondary school and claim that every time someone had their dinner money stolen, it was Lucy that was to blame? Or maybe there's some incident related to marbles when she was at primary school. Maybe she just came out the womb and started committing crimes immediately, even though no one's ever witnessed anything and there's no evidence. Considering we don't require any actual evidence to refer things to the Crown Prosecution Service, why don't we blame Lucy for kidnapping Shergar and the disappearance of Lord Lucan? I'm sure someone could produce some semi-reasonable figures to prove that this was her fault. And then secondly, I can't wait for when someone claims that these cases have nothing to do with statistics. That will be a laugh riot. Finally, I've been asked to mention this signature that I know comes from some of the pioneering campaigners in Lucy's case. And I know the number of signatures on it has increased quite significantly recently. I'll try to remember to leave this in the description for this video, but if you just Google refer Lucy Letby's case back to the Court of Appeal and do try to spread that as much as possible, it would be appreciated. I should say as well that I did mention that I'm going to introduce something on the channel that people can get involved with. At that time, I will mention a few other things that can be done as well. But we're just kind of working on a few things to put this in place, and then I'll be able to ask for people's help on the channel. It's something that will probably be operational and something will build up over several months, and it's something that can really help Lucy and help with public opinion and help her prospects of getting out of prison. I've also been asked to raise awareness of this cause as well. So this is Kathleen Folbigg, who I've mentioned previously. I went to an event related to her where she spoke at the Francis Crick Institute. Kathleen was in prison for 20 years, wrongfully convicted of murdering her own children. She also lost 4 children, and I was really staggered by the kind of quiet dignity and bravery that she showed when speaking. And she actually said, the whole time I was in prison, the only thing I really wanted to know was what happened to my children and why did they die. And I thought about that, and I could think it would be incredibly, it would eat you up inside, wouldn't it? If you'd lost 4 children, you didn't know why, and you were in prison for their murder, and the whole time you're just thinking, why is this happening? And eventually, there were genetic causes that were identified. So there's this petition. This is an Australian case, of course, so it has been reported on in Britain, but it hasn't been publicised that much. But this is an international petition that you can sign. Essentially, Kathleen is now out of prison. She was her convictions were quashed a couple of years back, and she was exonerated. But she just received $2 million in compensation. So I should mention this is Australian dollars, so it's approximately equal to £900,000. So in this letter to the Premier and Attorney General, it is stated that this barely covers 20 years of income. Kathleen has lost her house, her super, I think that's related to pension, superannuation or something, her employability, her assets, and she's not been compensated for the horrific injustice done to her through 20 years of wrongful imprisonment, prosecution on false grounds by the state, psychological injury, and immeasurable reputational damage. I should say as well that her friend Tracy Chapman basically had to meet her from prison and put her up in her house, as far as I know, because she just literally had nowhere else to go. A man who was wrongly imprisoned for 19 years received $7 million in compensation. Your government appears to have a double standard towards women, and this has affected your judgment in this case. So it goes on. So I was asked by a member of Kathleen's legal team to circulate this, so I said I'd be very happy to do that. So I do think this is a good cause and something that people should sign. Kathleen has suffered enormously, and as I said, I consider her to be a person of enormous dignity, bravery, and an almost superhuman lack of bitterness, considering what she's been through. She deserves to live in absolute comfort for the rest of her life, so I really wanted to highlight this petition. Finally, if I could just mention that if you haven't done so already, subscribing to the channel is very helpful. It's been increasing a lot recently, and I'm hugely grateful for that. But there's still a lot of people that watch videos that aren't subscribed, so if you found this useful and informative, please do subscribe to the channel. It also helps to like the video, and if you have any comments to make, I always enjoy reading them as well. So as always, if you have any comments, queries, corrections, suggestions, or anything else to say at all, please do leave a comment. Always look forward to reading them, and I'll see you the next time I record a video.